Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Friday, 22 March 2024. Some comments on my episode on Ernst Troeltsch gave me pause to think about war. And I've often said that philosophy of history and philosophy of war are close cousins. So this episode is about that kinship between war and history. Troeltsch was an enthusiastic supporter of the German war effort at the beginning of the First World War, though he did change his views over the period of the war, as did most people who were alive at that time. There's a good discussion of Troeltsch's wartime activity in a book by Robert J. Rubanowitz says, Crisis in Consciousness, the Thought of Ernst Troeltsch, from which I will quote a paragraph. Quote, on 2 August, Germany sent an ultimatum to Belgium demanding the right to cross Belgian territory. War was declared on France the following day, and on 4 August, German troops crossed the Belgian border. It was to the theme following the declaration of mobilization that Troeltsch addressed himself in this first of several dozen public wartime exhortations. His remarks were not original and were undoubtedly reiterated during these early days of the war in hundreds of wartime rallies, not only in Germany, but in the homelands of all the war's participants. Yet they were needed at the time and exceedingly appropriate. In his speech, the motif of unity was the central thought. Peace and worker will join hands, Troeltsch exclaimed, and the nation will stand together as one man, united from the extreme right to the extreme left. He felt Germany was entering into a struggle for its very life and continued existence as a nation against envy, hatred, and the spirit of revenge. In thus defending German values, Troeltsch urged, Germany was in effect fighting for the freedom and development of humanity itself, unquote. The response by Ernst Troeltsch was the rule, not the exception. Most intellectuals at the time, including philosophers and theologians, historians, and scientists, at least initially supported the war. Today, we want to believe that, and I should say against all expectations and evidence, that intelligent individuals everywhere will categorically reject war. But this has never been true. And the support for war wasn't tepid or hesitant either. Initial support for the war upon its outbreak was so enthusiastic that it came to be called the August Madness. Not everyone was caught up in the madness. There were a few exceptions, and Bertrand Russell's account of the August Madness is especially helpful since he personally knew many of the intellectuals who were swept up in the war fever of August 1914. Russell was both horrified and unable to comprehend the celebratory atmosphere of the time. So here's a quote from his autobiography. Quote, the first days of the war were to me utterly amazing. My best friends, such as the Whiteheads, were savagely warlike. Men like J.L. Hammond, who had been writing for years against participation in a European war, were swept off their feet by Belgium. As I had long known from a military friend at the Staff College, Belgium would inevitably be involved. I had not supposed important publicists so frivolous as to be ignorant of this vital matter, unquote. The reference to Belgium is what came to be called the Rape of Belgium at the beginning of the First World War, and this requires a little bit of background to make it meaningful. So, a quick sketch. In the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, Belgium was part of the Netherlands, but it subsequently, separated itself from the Netherlands, and by the 1839 Treaty of London, it was established as a neutral nation state, neutral by treaty, and the violation of which neutrality would be an act of war and would automatically draw in other nation states into any conflict. The Schlieffen Plan, which was the German plan for the war, was predicated upon the Germans marching into northern France through Belgium. Schlieffen, who did not live to see the war he planned, said, let the last man on the right brush the channel with his sleeve. So the idea was that the bulk of German forces would go through northern Belgium all the way up to the English Channel and then come down from the north on Paris. So Schlieffen planned for the bulk of the force on the right coming into France through Belgium to be an overwhelming force that would involve the greater part of Germany's armed forces. And Germany knew that the violation of Belgian neutrality would bring other nation states into the conflict, and the Schlieffen Plan was built around this assumption. Germany would rapidly go through Belgium to take Paris before the Russians were involved, and after France had been defeated, they would transport the army by train to the Eastern Front and then defeat the Russians after the French. So the timetable was everything, and that was part of the problem. But there were other problems. Von Moltke, who was in charge of the German forces and who did not live to see the end of the war he started, had weakened the right. And the Russians mobilized more rapidly than expected, which resulted in the Battle of Tannenberg on the Eastern Front, which the Germans did win, but at the cost of drawing off forces from the Western Front. The invasion of Belgium was predictably messy, and the Germans conducted many reprisals in Belgium against the civilian population, which they justified as measures taken against civilian partisans. And what reprisals mean is that Belgians who were suspected of being partisan were lined up against a wall and shot in the thousands. So German conduct in Belgium provoked a significant backlash among all the European powers. But it was not only a diplomatic backlash, there was a significant popular backlash, especially after the burning of Louvain, which started on the 25th of August, 1914. Louvain is and was more so a beautiful little university town with lots of incredibly elaborate Brabantine Gothic buildings and an enormous library of the University of Louvain filled with medieval manuscripts. And the Germans claimed to have been sniped at by civilians, so they burned the town, among many other atrocities in Belgium. And there was a backlash against the atrocities, and in Germany there was a backlash against the backlash. There was a manifesto that was published that came to be called the Manifesto of the 93, dated 4 October 1914, which was addressed to the civilized world from the professors of Germany. So I looked through the list of the 93 names who signed it, and the ones that leapt out at me because they're familiar to me were Wilhelm Windelband, who was a philosopher of history I mentioned many times, who was responsible for the distinction between the ideographic and the nomothetic. Karl Lamprecht, on whom I have recorded an episode, the physicist Max Planck, philosopher and psychologist Wilhelm Wundt, the biologist Ernst Haeckel, who was the first to formulate ecology, the historian Eduard Meyer, philosopher Ralph Eucken, and the mathematician Felix Klein, famous for the Klein bottle. Interestingly, Ernst Troeltsch was not among the signatories. I don't know if he wasn't asked, or if he was asked if he refused, or if something else came up, but he's not among those that I was able to discover who signed the Manifesto of the 93. The mobilization for the war was not only the mobilization of soldiers for the army, but it was also the mobilization of popular sentiment on both sides of the conflict. And that became one of the most important developments of mass war in an age of popular sovereignty. The European wars of the 18th century had largely been wars of maneuver between professional armies, and they had relatively little involvement with the civilian population. With the advent of mass society, the mass support of the population was necessary for a major war effort, and the European public obligingly provided the support to every nation state that declared war and began mobilization. What we could call the not only support for, but the vicarious participation in the war, at least in the early days, can be considered an additional trigger for the escalation of the war that allowed what might have been just another localized conflict within the Balkans to escalate into a planetary scale conflict. The philosopher Hannah Arendt has argued that it was the emergence of mass man that resulted in a discontinuity in history in the 20th century and the tradition between the 20th century and the tradition of history that preceded it. Arendt's primary work on mass man is The Origins of Totalitarianism. But in another book, collection of papers titled Between Past and Future, she explicitly identified mass phenomenon as a break in recent history. Quote, neither the 20th century aftermath nor the 19th century rebellion against tradition actually caused the break in our history. This sprang from a mass of chaos perplexities on the political scene and of mass opinions in the spiritual sphere, which the totalitarian movements, through terror and ideology, crystallized into a new form of government and domination. Totalitarian domination as an established fact, which in its unprecedentedness cannot be comprehended through the usual categories of political thought, and whose crimes cannot be judged by traditional moral standards or punished within the legal framework of our civilization, has broken the continuity of Occidental history. The break in our tradition is now an accomplished fact, unquote. Going back to the beginning of the war, on the 2nd of August, 1914, which was incidentally the same day that a young Adolf Hitler was celebrating in the Odeonsplatz in Munich, along with thousands of others, Bertrand Russell wrote about his evening stroll around Trafalgar Square. Again, this is a quote from his autobiography. Quote, I spent the evening walking around the streets, especially in the neighborhood of Trafalgar Square, noticing cheering crowds and making myself sensitive to the emotions of the passers-by. During this and the following days, I discovered to my amazement that average men and women were delighted at the prospect of war. I had fondly imagined, which most pacifists contended, that wars were forced upon a reluctant population by despotic and Machiavellian governments. I had noticed during previous years how carefully Sir Edward Grey lied in order to prevent the public from knowing the methods by which he was committing us to the support of France in the event of war. I naively imagined that when the public discovered how he had lied to them, they would be annoyed, instead of which they were grateful to him for having spared them the moral responsibility, unquote. Russell's further reflections on the August Madness also tell how he had to change his ideas of historical causality and explanation as a result of these experiences. Again, I quote from the autobiography, quote, although I did not foresee anything like the full disaster of the war, I foresaw a great deal more than most people did. The prospect filled me with horror, but what filled me with even more horror was the fact that the anticipation of carnage was delightful to something like 90% of the population. I had to revise my views on human nature. At that time, I was wholly ignorant of psychoanalysis, but I arrived for myself at a view of human passions not unlike that of the psychoanalysts. I arrived at this view in the endeavor to understand the popular feeling about the war. I had supposed until that time that it was quite common for parents to love their children, but the war persuaded me that it was a rare exception. I had supposed that most people liked money better than almost anything else, but I discovered that they liked destruction even better. I had supposed that intellectuals frequently loved truth, but I found here again that not 10% of them prefer truth to popularity. Gilbert Murray, who had been a close friend of mine since 1902, was a pro-Boer when I was not. I therefore naturally expected that he would again be on the side of peace, yet he went out of his way to write about the wickedness of the Germans and the superhuman virtue of Sir Edward Grey. I became filled with despairing tenderness toward the young men who were to be slaughtered, and with rage against the statesmen of Europe, unquote. Russell engaged in anti-war activism during the First World War and was eventually jailed for it. While he was in jail, he wrote an introduction to mathematical philosophy, which the governor of the prison was obliged to read to see if there were any seditious tendencies in it, and before it could be published. Russell is a witty and entertaining writer, and sometimes he allows his wit to run away with him. So the passage I just quoted has a lot of interesting ideas about how wars start, but it misses a lot because of its unhelpful rhetoric. Of course, many, if not most, parents love their children, but they also love their ideals and their country, and they see no contradiction in loving their sons and sending them to war. On the contrary, military service in wartime is sometimes seen as a privilege and an honor, and this privilege and honor is sometimes shared within the family milieu as an expression of familial love. That might be utterly foreign within some families, but within other families, it's quite common. Parents who shield their children from the realities of war can do them as much harm as parents who acquiesce in the drafting of their children. And when parents use their influence and social position to keep their sons out of war, it can become a source of social friction, like it did in the US during the Vietnam War. So Russell's psychology leaves something to be desired in its lack of subtlety. But he was right to have called into question his previous beliefs about the war and to look for some other historical explanation for the advent of war and its subsequent expansion. After his prison sentence, Russell eventually gave a series of public lectures on his new views on wars and its causes, which were eventually published as Principles of Social Reconstruction in the UK and Why Men Fight in the US. One of these lectures was attended by the young philosopher T.E. Home, who, writing as North Staff pseudonymously, called Russell's work "the kind of rubbish we oppose." Public letters were exchanged. Russell defended his views, and Home attacked Russell for his pacifism. It's quite unlikely that anyone changed their mind or learned anything as the result of this exchange of what we could call incommensurable perspectives. There is an unbridgeable temperamental gap between men like Bertrand Russell and men like T.E. Home. Today, we would say that Russell and Home had different values, and in fact, Home, in his responses to Russell, uses the philosophical language of values and axiology to defend his criticism of Russell. Russell and Home together serve as an interesting window onto the debate over war, its causes and its motivations. But their debate was by no means unique, nor were the conditions leading up to World War I unique in the initial outpouring of public support. Many wars have seen an outpouring of public support. And public support for war can appear out of the most unlikely circumstances. One of the most earliest instances of mass public support during the earliest period of the age of popular sovereignty we can cite would be the origins of the Napoleonic Wars. After the French Revolution, after the Reign of Terror, the Thermidorian reaction, and the rule of the Directory, it would be easy to argue that France would be exhausted, demoralized, and in no condition whatsoever to wage war. But once Napoleon came to power, he raised an army of 1 million men or more, and French revolutionary armies swept across Europe and initiated a generation of warfare on the continent unlike anything seen since the 30 Years' War. Even after Napoleon abdicated and was banished to the island of Elba, when he returned, he was able to raise another army. And then when he lost at Waterloo, the British shipped him off to the even more isolated island of St. Helena to make sure nothing like the 100 Days happened again. Probably that was a legitimate concern, viewing what happened after his return from Elba. While many wars have seen an outpouring of public support, we still have to see the support for the First World War and its outbreak in its historical context. Europe had not seen a continent-wide war since the Napoleonic Wars 100 years before. The largest war between the Napoleonic Wars and the World War I was the American Civil War, and military representatives from most of the European nation states were present as observers in the American Civil War, since that's where the action was at the time. Obviously, this left Europe and European civilians untouched, and the experience of war was distant and easy to ignore. The American Civil War saw the introduction of technologies that were to be a foretaste of what was to come in industrialized warfare. In particular, I'm thinking of the Gatling gun, the use of rifling both in small arms and artillery, steam-powered ironclads, and the use of the telegraph for rapid communications. In Europe during this period, there were wars, but they were a number of relatively small wars that over a relatively short duration. So, for example, the first Schleswig War from March 1848 to May 1852, the second Schleswig War from February 1864 to October 1864, the Austro-Prussian War from June 1866 to July 1866, and the Franco-Prussian War from July 1870 to January 1871. All of these wars I've mentioned could be characterized as wars involved in the consolidation of a unified Germany, which was only just in formation during this period. The Russo-Japanese War in 1904-1905 was different. It was geographically distinct, and it could also be called one of the more prescient conflicts before the First World War, because it made use of the Maxim gun and dreadnought battleships, which was a further foretaste, like the Civil War, of what was to come. And in the wars immediately preceding the First World War, there were a number of small and not so small wars in the Balkans. When World War I began, most people expected a short, sharp war like the Franco-Prussian War, strictly limited in spatial extent and temporal duration. This expectation was part of the miscalculation that allowed the war to grow to planetary proportions. But that wasn't the only factor. There was also the factor of technology, in particular the technology of communications and transportations, which had changed utterly from the Napoleonic era. There was also the factor of mass society, which I mentioned earlier in relation to the writings of Hannah Arendt. Mass war conducted by mass man required new mechanisms, and one of these mechanisms was the mobilization of mass society for war. Partly mobilization was about calling up men in the millions to serve in the armed forces, which all the combatant nation states did. But mobilization also involved the conversion of industry to war production and the realignment of the entire economy of the nation state to direct resources into the conflict. Here we see the prescience of the Italian general Giulio Due. I mentioned him in my essay, on my episode on the bombing of Dresden, who predicted that this would happen. And the ability of a nation, of a society, to mobilize rapidly and completely came to be understood as the key to national success in war. It's like the military equivalent of first mover advantage, the first nation state capable of fully mobilizing their population and their economy for war had an enormous advantage in the war. After Clausewitz, who cut his teeth in the Napoleonic Wars, total war became a talking point. But after World War I, Ernst Junger wrote a paper titled Total Mobilization, which is the basis of his later book called The Worker. And Junger understood, perhaps was among the first to explicitly understand, that total mobilization was what made total war possible. And Junger's paper wasn't merely a piece of warmongering or propaganda. It was, for example, discussed intensively by Heidegger with his milieu. And there's an extract about this in Richard Wollen's book, The Heidegger Controversy, A Critical Reader, in which he quotes Heidegger as saying, Ernst Junger's essay on total mobilization appeared. In this essay, the fundamental outlines of his 1932 book, The Worker, are articulated. In a small group, I discussed these writings at this time along with my assistant, Werner Brock, and attempted to show how in them an essential comprehension of Nietzsche's metaphysics is expressed, insofar as the history and the contemporary situation of the West is seen and foreseen in the horizon of this metaphysics. On the basis of these writings, and even more especially on the basis of their foundations, we reflected on what was to come. That is, we sought thereby to confront the later in discussions, unquote. I think Heidegger or someone else said that Ernst Junger, was Nietzsche's only true heir, as it were. Walter Bonneman, the well-known critic, wrote a review of the book in which Junger's essay, Total Mobilization, appeared. The book was called Krieg und Krieger, War and Warrior. And in Bonneman's review of that collection of papers, which he referred to it as depraved mysticism, and called it, quote, nothing other than an uninhibited translation of the principles of l'art pour l'art to war itself, unquote. So in other words, he was saying that the book was a war for war's sake. Once the logic of total mobilization was understood, you could say it was almost inevitable that this total mobilization would constitute a self-fulfilling prophecy for total war. And the new technologies available in 1914 meant that total war would be planetary in scale. With this war of unprecedented scope and scale, and which I call the first planetary scale industrialized war, people then and ever since then have gone looking for explanations, which in the heat of war meant looking for scapegoats. Just as there was an enormous outpouring of literature after the war, there was an enormous outpouring of literature during the war. Timely things, you could say, that were attempted to that were supposed to speak to people's concerns of the immediate matter of the war. During the war itself, in 1916, the philosopher George Santayana published a book called Egotism in German Philosophy, in which he teased out a tradition from Goethe through Kant, Fichte, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. Quote, egotism, subjectivity in thought, and willfulness in morals, which is the soul of German philosophy, is by no means a gratuitous thing. It is a genuine expression of the pathetic situation in which any animal finds itself upon earth, and any intelligence in the universe. It is an inevitable and initial circumstance in life. But like every material accident, it is a thing to abstract from and to discount as far as possible. The perversity of the Germans, the childishness and sophistry of their position, lies only in glorifying what is an inevitable impediment and in making time on an earthly station from which the spirit of man, at least in spirit, is called to fly, unquote. 10 years after the war was over, in 1928, Clive Bell of the Bloomsbury Group, Clive Bell was, by the way, known as the least pleasant, least likable member of the Bloomsbury Group. And he, in a admittedly humorous vein, discusses how Nietzsche came to be blamed for the war and for the German way of war, at least at first. So, quote, down with Nietzsche. Ah, that was fun. Drubbing the nasty blackguard, the man who presumed to sneer at liberals without admiring liberal unionists. He was an epileptic, it seemed, a scrofulous fellow, and no gentleman. We told the working men about him. We told them about his being the prophet of German imperialism, the poet of Prussia, and the lickspittle of the Junkers. And where anyone who had compromised himself by dabbling in German literature, so unpatriotic to call our scholarship in question, we called him a traitor and shut him up. Those were the days, the best of 1914, when France and England were defending Paris against Nietzsche and the Russian steamroller was catching him in the back, unquote. But dunking on Nietzsche wasn't really a viable war aim. So Bell goes on to humorously consider how civilization came to be called the positive war aim the British were casting about to find. Quote, then it was that to some more comprehensive mind, to someone enjoying a sense of history and his own importance, to the Prime Minister or Professor Gilbert Murray, I dare say, came the fine and final revelation that what we were fighting for was civilization, unquote. Recall from an earlier quote that Bertrand Russell wrote he was surprised to find Gilbert Murray on the pro-war side. But Russell shouldn't have been surprised, as most people were, and most intellectuals were, and most professors were. The historical context of the eruption of the First World War, specifically that it was a major war that occurred after a long peace and was expected to be a brief diversion after which events would go back to normal fairly quickly, suggests a possible partial explanation for the August Madness and the many intellectuals who rushed to demonstrate their enthusiasm for the conflict. Peter Turchin, in his book, End Times, Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration, explains violence in cyclical and generational terms, in which conflicts, quote, would simply be replayed again when a new generation, not immunized against violence, took over, unquote. It is the personal experience of violence that immunizes a society against escalation, one person at a time. And if this experience is absent, the escalation could be unchecked. Quote, high levels of violence accelerate the transition of most radicals into moderates. The radicalization curve falls as precipitously. Because radicals are the ones who drive violence, instability also declines. The social system regains its stability. But in this inertial scenario, the root cause of instability, the wealth pump, continues to operate. Gradually, elite numbers begin increasing. Meanwhile, the moderates who suppressed it, the peak of violence, are slowly retiring and dying off. The uneasy peace holds for the next generation, 25 to 30 years, but then there is a repeat 50 years later, unquote. So is this a sufficient explanation for war enthusiasm? How much violence is required to immunize a society against escalation? The same individual whose comment on my Ernst Troeltsch video prompted this episode expressed a view that things are different now, and they're different for, interestingly, technological reasons, just like wars are different. Quote, Turchin might be right about the past, but nowadays, with TV, radio, etc., I think people are well aware of what war means. Let's hope they are in Brussels, Washington, and Moscow too, unquote. I don't agree with this. I think there are some individuals who might find a graphic record of the horrors of war off-putting, and it may be enough to immunize those individuals against violence, but there will be others who are attracted and fascinated by the violence. Partly because this would be because of their unfamiliarity with violence after a generational gap. And that makes it, because it's unfamiliar, it is mysterious and interesting. But it's also partly because of the human, all too human attraction to violence, whether familiar or unfamiliar. It's uncomfortable to talk about this because it appears unflattering to human nature, but there's nothing new in it. Freud especially faced it head on in his book, Civilization and Its Discontents. Quote, men are not gentle, friendly creatures wishing for love who simply defend themselves if they are attacked, but a powerful measure of desire for aggression has to be reckoned as part of their instinctual endowment, unquote. Freud had, of course, lived through the First World War, and he saw the Second World War approaching. He didn't live to see it. But many people saw it coming. It was no mystery. When the Treaty of Versailles was being signed, the French general during the First World War, Ferdinand Foch, who wanted a permanent occupation of the Rhineland after the First World War, that didn't happen, said, this is not peace, this is an armistice for 20 years. And he was exactly right, but he didn't live to see the continuation of the war he predicted. And we can view World War I and World War II together as one long war. And when we do, it resembles, in some respects, the 30 Years' War in its brutality and its unresolved war aims. We could also compare it to the Peloponnesian War, which had lasted for a very long time and had an initial period of hostilities, a long peace in between, and then finished off with another period of hostilities. We can even expand further from that and say that the 20th century, taken on the whole, resembles the 100 Years' War, again, with its brutality and unresolved war aims. If we take the century from the beginning of the First World War to the end of the Cold War, there was a contemporary historian or 20th century historian who referred to the short 20th century because it extended from 1914 to 1989 or so, as compared to the long 19th century. So the middle of the 20th century in particular was a convulsion of violence of almost apocalyptic proportion. The sky was filled with airplanes. The sea was filled with ships above and submarines below. Great cities were destroyed in a single night. Entire populations were displaced, and millions upon millions were killed. And this proved to be a robust immunization of violence. I asked previously, after quoting Turchin, how much violence do you have to immunize a society for a period of time? Because of the scope of the carnage of the First World War, a consensus emerged among the survivors that civilization might not survive the next such convulsion. And since that time, military engagements have been carefully managed to make sure they don't escalate to totality. But as time passes, the memory will fade. Those who saw the spectacle with their own eyes will die. And like the defenders of outmoded scientific theories, their version of events will be supplanted by a historian's narrative that speaks more directly to the dominant paradigm of the moment. When each generation rewrites history for its own purposes, it does so in the light of its own experiences, be they experiences of violence that immunize a society or experiences of stability that render violence mysterious and therefore romantic. With the passage of time, enough time, there will come a time again when apocalyptic ideas have a certain luster, you could say, and men will be once again fascinated that such things as happened before were possible. And when we reach that point, they'll dust off the lessons of the past and plan the next epic convulsion that other men will eventually read about, study, chronicle, describe, and attempt to understand how it could all happen again. So how can human beings be fascinated by the violence of war? Again, this is one of the things we don't like to talk about, partly from the discomfort of facing it. But the reality is that some men have the peak experiences of their life in combat. This isn't universal by any manner of means, but it doesn't have to be universal to have a certain degree of explanatory power. Of the men who are sent into combat, some are broken by it, and they are never the same again after it. Many, perhaps a bulk of men who go into war, tolerate it as best as they can. They aren't broken by the experience, but they also have no love for it. But there is a minority for whom combat is a peak experience. As with all instinctive attractions, some men only discover that this is their element after they have been exposed to it. But once again, there's still a minority of individuals who know themselves well enough on an intuitive level, you could say, to know what their calling is, even if they've never seen it or never been exposed to it and never even heard of it. I can think of some fictional scenarios in which societies try to extirpate war, and by eliminating all references to it. I think the young adult fiction, The Giver, that was made into a film, this is one of the themes, and it's at least my interpretation of it. The kind of men who have an intuitive feeling for war would create war for themselves, even if all memory of it had been extirpated from our records. I once met a man like this personally, and his stories of the Second World War were truly apocalyptic. He said, and I quote from memory, "We went over there to kill and destroy, and that's what we did." Was this every soldier's experience? Of course not. But it is the experience of a few, and these few require war for their self-actualization, if we want to employ the language of Maslow, to which I'd already implicitly implied earlier about peak experiences. Perhaps the most famous example of this kind of intuitive grasp of warfare is Ernst Jünger, whom I mentioned earlier, whose memoir of the First World War, the Storm of Steel, is a classic of the genre of war memoirs, and it made him a very famous figure in the interwar period in Germany. Ernst Jünger and Oswald Spengler, together, the two of them were considered the two most prominent members of what's called the conservative revolution in Germany in the interwar period. Jünger described what came to be called the Fronterlebnis, the experience of being at the front for those who flourished in the violent atmosphere of war. This wasn't the typical experience of the war, but it was a new experience of war that emerged from this changed social and technological conditions under which the war was fought. And it wasn't just the Germans like Jünger. On every side of the war, there were men who discovered themselves and their calling in the trenches. Among the Italians, they were called the Arditi, the bold ones. And they didn't just tolerate the war, they gloried in it. You may have heard the term Arditi. There's a string quartet that calls itself the Arditi Quartet. It's sometimes claimed that the last form of the personal duel in industrialized warfare was the experience of fighter pilots in dogfights. Curiously, we sometimes run across that claim at the same time we find the claim that air warfare is dehumanizing, impersonal, and technical. But everyone's heard of the Red Baron, and many people have heard of the great aviation aces of the Second World War. But aces emerged in all theaters and all forms of combat, in tanks, in submarines, and among frontline soldiers. These were men who intuitively mastered the new technologies of war and took to them by instinct. This was implicitly foreseen by Giulio Due, the Italian general that I mentioned earlier as a prophet of air war. But the spirit that drove this forward was made pretty explicit by the Italian futurists, and especially Filippo Marinetti's Futurist Manifesto that was first published in 1909, in which he wrote, quote, "We affirm that the world's magnificence has been enriched by a new beauty, the beauty of speed, a racing car whose hood is adorned with great pipes like serpents of explosive breath. A roaring car that seems to ride on grape shot is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace," unquote, referencing a great late antique sculpture that now stands in one of the central halls of the Louvre. Earlier, I mentioned that Walter Bonneman wrote a review of Ernst Jünger's edited collection, War and Warriors, which included Jünger's essay on total mobilization. Bonneman opened his review of that book with a quote from Léon Daudet, which he gives as, "L'automobile, c'est la guerre." The automobile is war. And Bonneman commented on this, quote, "This surprising association of ideas was based on the perception of an increase in technical artifacts, in power sources, and in tempo generally, that the private sector can neither absorb completely nor utilize adequately, but which nonetheless demand vindication," unquote. Despite Bonneman's explicit recognition of what he calls a surprising association of ideas between the car and violence, we can see how utterly Bonyamin misses the plot in the rest of his review of War and Warriors. Here's another quote from Bonyamin. Quote, "These authors nowhere observe that the new warfare of technology and materiel, which appears to some of them as the highest revelation of existence, dispenses with all the wretched emblems of heroism that here and there have survived the World War," unquote. But heroism wasn't eliminated. It was transformed. Maybe we'd like to say it was transfigured into something unrecognizable. I'm sure the people that Bonyamin talked about the First World War hated it and were repelled by it. And just like the temperamental gap between Bertrand Russell and T.E. Home, there's an unbridgeable temperamental gap between somebody like Ernst Jünger and Walter Bonyamin. And Ernst Jünger was one of those who came into his element in war, and you could call him an ace of hand-to-hand combat on the front. The personal duel and the sense of honor intrinsic to this form of combat lived on in planetary industrialized warfare, but it became a marginal experience, an outlier in the midst of the millions of men who went to war and who were in no sense suited for killing. And Jünger wrote about this in The Storm of Steel from the chapter My Last Assault. Quote, "Most of all, I was busy with the training of a small shock troop, since I had come to understand in the course of the last few engagements that there was an increasing rearrangement of our fighting strength in progress. To make an actual breach or advance, there was now only a very limited number of men on whom one might rely, who had developed into a particularly resilient body of fighters, whereas the bulk of men were at their best fit to lend support. Given these circumstances, it might be better to be at the head of a small, determined group than the commander of an uncertain company," unquote. In comparison to the many millions who fought and died and had no taste for war, the few who took to modern industrial warfare resent only a small fragment of the total. But I think a lot of men in combat, even if they were not the kind of man that the Jünger was, at least saw the attraction in it and why others were fascinated by it or gloried in it. J. Glenn Gray was a soldier in the Second World War, a counterintelligence officer and a philosopher, and a very different man from Ernst Jünger. And he fought in a different war than Jünger. 20 years after the Second World War was over, he wrote a book called The Warriors, Reflections on Men in Combat, making an effort to describe some of the fascination that men have for battle. Quote, "Millions of men in our day, like millions before us, have learned to live in war's strange elements and has discovered in it a powerful fascination. The emotional environment of warfare has always been compelling. It has drawn most men under its spell. Reflections and calm reasoning are alien to it," unquote. And Gray also quotes Ernst Jünger. Quote, this passage from Jünger is quoted by J. Glenn Gray. Quote, "The monstrous desire for annihilation, which hovered over the battlefield, thickened the brains of the men and submerged them in a red fog. We called to each other in sobs and stammered disconnected sentences. A neutral observer might have believed that we were seized by an excess of happiness," unquote. No doubt there are altered states of consciousness that are only experienced in battle. Experiencing an altered state of consciousness for the first time under unique circumstances is going to make an impression on anyone. And if you take millions of young men in their physical prime, already combative, driven by testosterone, and you expose them to excitement and danger, it's no wonder that some of them have the time of their lives, even if others are as I said earlier, destroyed by the experience. The problem of enthusiasm for war, whether on the part of combatants or on the part of intellectuals, is partly a psychological problem. Understanding how the individual responds to war, how their intentions, their expectations, their desires, and disappointments all feed into conflict escalation. It's also a sociological problem of how groups of individuals respond to social forces, which can also be called social psychology. Today, social psychology doesn't give us much help, as it is the branch of psychology that has been most compromised by the replication crisis. So unfortunately, social psychology is corrupt today, and we're on our own. We're thrown back on the resources of philosophy from which the positive sciences originally sprang. So enthusiasm for war is also, we could say, a philosophical problem. For the analytical philosopher of history, there is the opportunity for conceptual clarification, for explanation, for laying bare the hidden threads of causality, and for heroic objectivity in the face of passion. Very few people want to be objective about war, but we can try to be. For the substantive philosopher of history, there are the questions of the inevitability or preventability of war, the intelligibility of war as part of the historical process, and the laying bare of the hidden secrets of the human heart, you can say. There are also a great many ethical questions. In my episode so far, I haven't laid any emphasis on the relationship between philosophy of history and ethics, but this is clearly an area ripe for further exposition. My recent episode on Nikolai Berdyaev could have been an opportunity to talk about this, because history was through and through a moral problem for Berdyaev. The problem of explanation in history that I touched on in relation to Patrick Gardner and Carl Hempel is also an ethical problem insofar as moral motives are drivers of historical action, and of inaction for that matter, unless we hold that human beings are mere marionettes with our strings pulled by natural forces. I don't say that moral motives are the sole drivers of action, but they count among the many drivers to action, some of which are moral, some of which are amoral, and some of which are immoral. Earlier, I noted the sense of honor that is attached to individual combat. And there are, of course, many values and virtues that are associated with war and with the soldier in combat. Valor, courage, boldness, steadfastness, integrity, chivalry. There are also values and virtues of societies that go to war for admirable ideals. We don't like to talk about that much today, but we will completely misunderstand ourselves and misunderstand our past if we don't attempt to understand the role of ideals in starting, escalating, and perpetuating warfare. It's only after a war has run its course and the bodies of soldiers begin returning from the battlefields that the ideals come to look tarnished in the eyes of most. In abstraction, in splendid isolation from their consequences, these are the ideals that found society and drive them forward in history. And perhaps that's what Walter Benjamin meant when he wrote that there has never been a document of culture which is not simultaneously one of barbarism. In the righteous condemnation of war, and the ideals and values and virtues celebrated in wartime are neglected, or they are intentionally obscured. Just as in times of war enthusiasm, like the August Madness, the ideals and the values and the virtues of peace are neglected or intentionally obscured. And so it ends up that we lurch back and forth from war to peace and back to peace again, and back to war again, I should have said, as in Turchin's generational model, but not as much from the chaotic, not as much from these generational motivations of immunization of against violence as from the chaotic process of history developing into what we could call an unstable oscillation that destroys the society that's exposed to these forces. Once again, the specter looms of human beings as being mere marionettes whose strings are pulled by the forces of history that we don't control. We haven't yet discovered a way to construct a social order that does not give way to these unstable oscillations between war and peace. There have been many hopeful attempts, and some of these are familiar to us in our own time, but none of them have endured over the long delay. And this is the point at which political philosophy intersects with the philosophy of history. There are, I think, more unsolved problems here than solved problems, and perhaps there are only unsolved problems here. So thanks for listening.